H.G. Wells was, of course, a great pioneer of science fiction. He called his books scientific romances. The term science fiction hadn't yet been coined. But unlike other writers of the period like Jules Verne, he wasn't interested in escapist fantasy. He had a very keen interest in social issues, political issues. He had quite a sense of humor. And The Island of Dr. Moreau, I think, approaches Swiftian satire more than any of his other books did. But he saw the metaphors of his time, the Victorian era, and the possibilities of exploiting them in his scientific romances. And they are still very much with us. There are several key books that were published in the 1880s and 1890s that still very much inform our approach to frightening entertainment today. They are Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells, and Dracula by Bram Stoker. These books all inform and illuminate each other, and they're surprisingly modern books, even though they were responses to immediate social and cultural circumstances. But nothing is ever new in history. History only repeats itself. And so it's fascinating that we can find similar uses for these stories in our modern media. One of the things that the Victorian horror writers were most riled up about was the idea of evolution. Darwin had published his works beginning in the 1850s, and I thought I would go back and find, there were these great public debates about Darwin, but there weren't. Unless you went to medical school, you weren't even taught Darwin, in his original writings. Instead, the public did engage Darwinism in this kind of filtered, distorted contexts of social Darwinism, the idea of the survival of the fittest. And this fit a certain conservative political mindset very well. The reason that some people aren't doing well is because they're just not up the evolutionary ladder as far as they could be. Darwin was horrified by these kinds of ideas because for him evolution was not a matter of progress or achievement or it was mere adaptation. But somehow in the popular mind the idea of evolution was very frightening. If you could go up the evolutionary ladder, maybe you could go down. And so this idea of cultural degeneration was a big hot button issue, and you just see it everywhere in every context in the 1890s. It certainly informs Jekyll and Hyde and Dorian Gray and Dracula. Wells is the one who seems to have some fun with it. He sees the possibility for social satire. And I think he told his son at one point that he really had intended Moreau to be kind of an homage to Jonathan Swift. And it doesn't quite get there, but it's kind of fun to step back and say, oh, well, is he writing about evolution, or is he writing about the Victorian obsession with evolution? And then it makes a lot of sense to us. These themes didn't go away. I mean, they started in the Victorian era. They carried right into the 20th century and to America. Here, they found their way into popular entertainment. In 1931, we had Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And always with these strange images of humans as animals. You have that with Frederick March in Jekyll and Hyde. In Frankenstein, it goes even further. You have the image of a mechanical man, a robot, with all the promises of the modern age just kind of dashed to pieces. And the Frankenstein monster is half robot and it's half ape. That heavy brow and the long arms, just these unmistakable cues. You see it in The Island of Lost Souls. You see it in Freaks. Many of the sideshow people have animal names. They're bird people. There was a turtle girl. And this goes back to a long tradition in circus presentation. In Europe, these themes were taking on a much darker cultural coloration. The year Frankenstein was released here, Dr. Josef Mengele was just getting out of medical school. And it's very, very creepy when you get up to the end of the 30s that the kinds of experiments that mad scientists are performing in American movies are actually going on in the camps. But this mix of eugenics and politics was a very, very strong movement in the early 20th century. And curiously, we see it in the growth of film censorship in America. One fascinating thing about Welles is that he brought up the trial of Oscar Wilde as a partial influence on the book. Now, he had finished a first draft of Moreau by the end of 1894. Wilde was tried twice on charges of gross indecency, meaning sodomy, in the spring of 1895. And later, Welles, writing about Moreau, said that there was a great trial at the time I was writing this book about the downfall of a man of genius. And he tried to do something with that in the context of his book. And it's really fascinating because during the trial, Wilde was repeatedly compared to animals. There was no concept of homosexuality as a sexual orientation. It was behavior. It was degenerate behavior. It was giving in to the beast. There were all kinds of bizarre theories. It's fascinating that in the film version, here we have Charles Laughton basically channeling the persona of Oscar Wilde in doing this. And exactly where this came from, we can't determine. Wilde would have been a great part for Laughton to play. He never would have done it. He was too closeted in his personal life to go public in that way. But it's not in the script. It's not in the stage directions, but he just zeroes in on this idea of Moreau as a sexual other. This may be the real reason that he doesn't try to impregnate Loda himself. He can't. It's fun that some of our greatest mad scientist characters, Moreau, Dr. Gogol in Mad Love, Peter Lorre, Ernest Thesiger in Bride of Frankenstein, they bring something to these characters that's perverse and strange, and it's not anywhere in the script. And so we have these three very, very eccentric mad scientists that we can't get out of our minds, even today. Welles was fascinated by the possibility of motion pictures and really wrote extensively on the topic and thought it could be a major art form. He was not so keen to have his own work adapted. He had turned down chances to have The Island of Dr. Moreau adapted to the stage. I think there was a request in around World War I to do a French stage production. And he didn't want his things tampered with. And he resisted Universal Studios with The Invisible Man. Horror pictures were obviously the big thing at the bottom of the Great Depression. And they had had a big success with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so threw themselves into Island of Lost Souls. And once again, Welles did not see his work translated as he wrote it. All the studios were looking to Universal for ideas about horror movies, because it seemed to be the next big thing, or the current big thing, and as well as talent. They conscripted Garrett Fort, who was the screenwriter who had worked on both Dracula and Frankenstein for Universal, which had become great box office bonanzas, completely unexpectedly. They were both considered gambles at the time they were made, but Fort seemed like a bankable choice, and so he worked on some of the early drafts. He was not finally credited. He worked with Waldemar Young, who was a screenwriter who worked on several of Todd Browning's films in the silent era, the Jungle Pictures, in particular. And Philip Wiley was a novelist and a journalist and kind of a media curmudgeon of a high order in the 30s and the 40s. He specialized in a kind of lacerating social commentary. And it's interesting to see how some of his ideas, especially his ideas about women, are reflected in Island of Lost Souls. He was an out-and-out misogynist. His post-war book, Generation of Vipers, was a great bestseller, and he just lashed out at American motherhood and American women. And lo and behold, there we have in Island of Lost Souls a really incredibly literal giving up on the possibility of women. There is no way the makers of Island of Lost Souls had not seen Todd Browning's Freaks, which they probably looked at with some trepidation because it was quite a disaster. It was supposed to be the horror film to end all horror films. And it has a climax very much like the climax of Island of Lost Souls, with the revolt of animalized people who take their revenge. And that was probably the most successful thing about Freaks, and so it was recapped rather brilliantly over at Paramount. But Todd Browning, who did Freaks, had been kind of obsessed his whole career with animalized characters who would have the names of animals, especially birds, or would behave like them, or be put into situations where their behavior degenerated. And had Todd Browning been more up to speed with the technology of sound, he would have been a good director for Island of Lost Souls. But the influence of Freaks is certainly there, if not just in the presence of Lila Hyams, who was the good girl character from Freaks. Some of us are real purists, and we would just love to see these novels adapted exactly as they were written. And that's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. It's not in the nature of motion pictures. So I'm not hoping for, completely faithful versions of any of these great classics, because the books are always there. But if our favorite monsters didn't take major departures from their source material and constantly reinvent themselves, they wouldn't be with us. They wouldn't live forever. And I'd rather have them than not.